The thermometer nailed to the sale barn door read 11 degrees on the morning Della Voss walked into the courthouse basement in Slade County, South Dakota, to buy a piece of ground that 3 generations of men had agreed was finished. It was the last Saturday of October, 1986, and the farm crisis had already gone through that country like a long illness, taking the weak places first and then circling back for the strong ones. Half the families in the room had a relative who had signed papers like the ones being signed that day. Some had come to bid. Most had come the way people come to the funeral of a neighbor they never much liked, to stand at the back and feel grateful it was somebody else's name on the deed. Della was 15. She had driven the 26 miles from the home place in her grandfather's old Ford, a pale green half-ton from 1972 with a heater that only blew warm if you kept the engine above 40, scraping frost off the inside of the windshield with a putty knife before light. On the seat beside her, she had a gray steel footlocker that had ridden in that same truck for 40 years, a manila folder gone soft at the corners, and a roll of bills inside a tobacco tin. The tin held $610. It was every cent she had earned, breaking colts and pulling calves and trapping beaver out of the creek since she was 9, and it was not enough to buy land. It was just enough to make a down payment if nobody in that basement understood what she understood. She wore her grandfather's canvas coat. It hung off her shoulders, and the cuffs swallowed her hands, and it smelled of him still, of pipe tobacco and bar soap and the faint iron smell of well water. People noticed the coat before they noticed her. A girl in a man's coat, holding a bidder's card with the number 9 printed on it in black marker, was not what anyone had driven through the cold to see. The auction was for what was left of the Doer place, 1,100 acres broken into 7 tracts and sold off by the bank to settle a note the Doers could no longer carry. Old Bill Doer had died the spring before. His sons had taken jobs in Gillette hauling coal and let the bank have the rest. There were 30-some registered bidders that morning, and Della knew most of them by sight. There were the local outfits, hard square men in seed caps and unzipped coveralls who had watched the Doer place for 30 years and had already decided, each of them privately, exactly what each tract was worth down to the dollar. And then there were the others, men up from Rapid City in pressed jeans and boots that had never been near a chute, who bought broke land in broke counties for nothing and sold it to dentists who wanted 40 acres and a view of the buttes. One of them kept checking a gold watch, as if his time cost more standing in that basement than the land did. The man running the sale was Vern Stroud. He was 63, a tall, narrow man with a voice like a road grader, and he had been calling auctions in that part of the state since before most of the people in the room were born. He was standing by the clerk's table sorting his cards when Della came down the basement stairs, and he looked up at her over his glasses with the weary expression of a man who has seen everything a small county can produce and is no longer surprised by any of it. He took her in. The coat, the number 9, the footlocker she set down by her boots. He leaned toward his clerk, a heavy-set woman named Phyllis who had clerked his sales for 20 years, and said something low. A couple of the men near the table smiled. The words carried about as far as Vern meant them to. Somebody's granddaughter come to watch the men throw their money in the stove. A few laughed. Della heard it. She had expected it, the way you expect the cold when you open a door in January. She did not look toward the laughing. She walked to the folding chairs at the back, set her folder across her knees, and opened it flat with both hands, the way her grandfather had taught her to open a map, smoothing it from the center out so the creases didn't tear. She was not there to watch the auction. She had read every page in that folder so many times she could have recited the tables in her sleep. And she was there for one thing only, and it was not on most of the maps tacked to the basement wall. The 7 tracts of the Doer place were laid out on a county plat that Phyllis had run off on the courthouse copier. Tract 1 had the house and the barn and a good submersible well, and everyone wanted it. Tract 2 had the river bottom hay ground, the only sure money on the place. Tract 3 had the best grass. 4, 5, and 6 were workable pasture in descending order of how much a man would have to apologize for them. And tract 7, the last one Vern would call that morning, was the one nobody in the basement had bothered to walk before the sale. It was a single quarter, 160 acres, away off in the northwest corner against the Montana line where the gumbo went to Badland and the buttes started shouldering up out of the prairie. The sale bill described it in one cold line. Tract 7, Northwest Quarter, Section 9. Native grass, no live water, abandoned well, sold as is, where is, no warranty. No live water. In that country, those 3 words were a death sentence. Land without water won't carry a cow through a dry summer, and dry summers in Slade County came 2 years in 5. Every man in the basement read that line and let his eyes slide onto the next tract. Della had started there. She had started there 8 months before, on a night when the snow was 3 feet deep against the north side of the house, and her grandfather had been dead exactly 6 days. To understand why she started there, you have to understand the old man, and the old man was not an easy thing to understand. His name was Halvor Ryerson, though no one had called him Halvor since his mother died. To the county he was Hal, and to Della he was Pa, because she had spent more of her growing up at his place than at her own, and a child names a thing what the thing is to her. Hal Ryerson had been a well man, not a rancher, though he ran a few head, and not a farmer, though he put up his own hay. He drilled wells. For 50 years he had run a cable tool rig, and then a worn-out rotary across the northern half of the state. His own father, a Norwegian, who homesteaded the country in 1909, with more faith than sense, had been one of the men who drilled the famous flowing wells of the early years, the artesian wells that came in under their own pressure and ran, day and night, without a pump. For about 20 years, men there believed the prairie was floating on an ocean. Then the wells started to quit, the pressure falling off as more and more holes tapped the same deep sand, and the drought of the 30s finished the belief for good. By the time Hal was grown, the whole county had decided the artesian water was a thing that had happened once and would not happen again, and that anyone who went looking for it now was a fool chasing his father's ghost. Hal did not think it was a ghost. Hal thought it was a sand layer, 600 or 700 feet down, that still held pressure in the places where the shale on top of it had not been punched too full of holes. He thought the old wells had mostly quit, not because the water was gone, but because the men who drilled them had drilled cheap, with bad casing and worse cement, and the holes had collapsed and rusted and choked themselves off long before the water did. He thought the county had buried something alive and put a stone over it, and he spent the back half of his life quietly digging at the edges of that stone. He could not get anyone to listen, and that was the thing about him Della understood that almost no one else did. The county liked Hal. He was honest, he was cheap, he came when you called him at 2 in the morning with a froze-up pump. But when he started in about the deep sand, people got a soft, kind look on their faces, the look you give an old man telling you about a fish he caught when you were a baby. They let him talk and went back to their shallow wells and their alkali, and when the dry years came, they sold their cows and blamed the sky. So Hal stopped talking, but he never stopped keeping the books, and that was the part of him that ended up in the footlocker. For 50 years, every hole he drilled and every hole he heard about, he wrote down. Depth, formation, water level, flow, the date, the weather, the man who owned it. He copied the logs of drillers dead before he was grown. He sent away $3 at a time to Pierre for the state's geological bulletins, the thin gray government books full of tables nobody read, and marked them up in pencil until the margins were black. Most men, when they get old, fill the house with photographs. Hal Ryerson filled a gun-gray Army footlocker with the truth about the water, and he raised his granddaughter to be the one person on earth who could read it. He started her young. He called it riding with him, but it was never just a ride. He would stop the truck along a fence line, put a pencil in her hand, and tell her to mark on a tablet exactly where the buffalo grass gave over to the wheatgrass, and then make her tell him why. He carried a brass pressure gauge in a leather case, an old thing with a cracked glass face that he had used to read the head on flowing wells back when there were still flowing wells, and he taught her to thread it onto a casing and read it twice, because the first number was what you hoped and the second was what was true. By 12, she could lay a driller's log next to a state cross-section and find the place where the two did not agree, which was always the interesting place because one of them was wrong and finding out which one was the whole game. He never told her the water under the Doer place was real. He didn't have to. He left her the footlocker. He died in February of 1986. It was the cold that did it, near as anybody could say, his heart giving out while he carried a sack of cake out to the horses in a blizzard. They found him the next morning, when the wind laid down, sitting against the corral post, with the snow drifted up over his legs and the sack still in his arms, and the look on his face, Della's mother said later, was not a frightened look. He left almost nothing. The little place was mortgaged. There was the truck, and there were the horses, and there was the footlocker, and tucked inside the front cover of his last logbook, on the blank leaf where a man might write his name, there was a single line in his square pencil hand. It was not a tender line. He was not a tender man on paper. It said, "The ground keeps better books than the bank." Della was 15 and the only person who knew what he meant. Her own family had reason to believe him. 2 years before he died, the bank had taken the Voss home place, the quarter section her father Roy had farmed and his father before him, sold out from under them at a sale not much different from this one. They had not lost it because they were lazy. They had lost it because the wheat price fell through the floor and the interest on the operating note climbed past 18%, and the two together made a kind of math no amount of work could beat. Roy Voss had been a steady man before that. After it, he got quiet in a way that didn't come back. On the day of the Doer sale, he did not come. He had said he would not stand in a basement and watch the bank sell a dead man's ground, and Della understood and went without him. So when she sat at the kitchen table that February, 6 days after the funeral, with the footlocker open on the floor and the snow ticking against the window, she was not looking for a fortune. She was looking for the thing her grandfather had left her to find. She started with the bulletins. She read them the way other girls her age read magazines, by lamplight, after the supper dishes, with the wood stove popping and her mother's sewing machine going in the other room. She read the 1948 State Water Supply Report for the northern counties cover to cover, twice, and on the second time through, in a table near the back, in a column most people would have skipped because it was nothing but a string of depths and a few abbreviations. She found it. The report described a confined sandstone aquifer, the deep Dakota sand her grandfather had spent his life believing in, lying under most of the township at depths the table gave to the foot. It said the sand carried water under pressure, and that in 2 test holes the survey drilled in 1947, the water had risen above the land surface and flowed without a pump. One of those holes was 4 miles east of the Doer place. The report gave its depth at 641 feet. And then, on the folded map tucked in the back of the report, a structural contour map that showed the shape of the buried rock the way a topographic map shows the shape of the land, she saw the thing that made her put the report down and pick it up again. The Doer quarter, Track 7, that worthless Badland corner against the Montana line, sat right on top of a low rise in the buried sand. Not a big one. A long, quiet swell in the rock, a place where the deep water stood a little higher, and the shale cap that held it down ran a little thicker. On that whole township, if a person were going to bet on hitting flowing water, the Doer corner was the single best place to put the drill. And nobody had, because everybody knew the Doer place was dry. She knew why everybody knew the place was dry. That was in the footlocker, too. There had been a flowing well on that quarter once, drilled by a syndicate in 1917 in the first rush of faith, and it had come in big and run for years and made the Doer homestead the envy of the country. Then in the bad summer of 1934, it quit, just stopped. From that day, the Doer place was the proof everyone pointed to that the deep water was gone for good. Hal had the log of the 1917 well. He had copied it in 1952 off a sheet of paper the syndicate's old foreman was using to start a fire. The log showed the 1917 well had been drilled to 210 feet and cased with stovepipe. 210 feet. The sand was at 640. The famous dead well of the Doer place had never touched the deep water at all. It had been a shallow well into a thin upper zone, a zone that always went dry in a real drought, and when it quit in 1934, the county had buried the whole idea of deep water with it, on the word of a hole that had stopped 500 feet short of the thing it got the blame for losing. In the margin of the 1917 log, in pencil gone soft with age, her grandfather had written one word, stovepipe, and under it, later, in darker lead, quit at the pipe, not at the water. Della read those two lines on a night in February, with her dead grandfather's coat over her shoulders and the wind walking the fence wires outside, and she understood that the most valuable 160 acres in Slade County had sat in plain sight for 50 years, with a price on it of nothing. The answer was written down in a gray book in the courthouse that no one had opened since Eisenhower, and in a footlocker no one but a strange old man had thought to keep. The land was not poor. The land had never been read. She had $610. She had until October. She did not tell her mother the whole of it for a long time. She told her she wanted to buy a piece of the Doer place. She did not say which piece. She spent the spring and summer the way a ranch kid spends them, working, and she spent the nights checking herself because she was old enough to know that wanting a thing to be true is the most dangerous reason to believe it. She read the 1948 report looking for the line that would prove her wrong. She walked the Doer quarter alone, 3 times, before the sale, and stood by the rusted iron standpipe of the dead 1917 well with her hand flat on the cold metal, looking at the long, low swell of land just where the map said the rock swelled too, at the lone dead cottonwood by the dry dam that somebody had once planted expecting water. Everything she could see agreed with everything she had read. She still could not be sure. You are never sure. That was a thing Hal had said. The ground does not promise. It only tells you the odds and lets you decide what you can stand to lose. Vern Stroud climbed onto the plywood riser at 9 o'clock and rapped the table twice with his ring, and the room went quiet. He sold the first 6 tracts in under 2 hours, about the way everyone knew he would. The home tract with the good well drew a hard fight between 2 local outfits and went high enough that Vern said into the microphone he hoped the winner had a rich uncle. The hay bottom went to the Burdette outfit, the biggest operation in that end of the county, run by a square red-faced man named Sig Burdette, who bought it without taking the cigarette out of his mouth and without once raising his card above his belt buckle. The grass went to the men who had walked it. The Rapid City money picked up Tract 5. By 11, the basement smelled of wet wool and cigarettes, and the bidders were thinking about dinner, and Vern called Tract 7. His voice changed when he called it. An auctioneer tells you what he thinks of a thing by how he reads it, and Vern read Tract 7 fast and flat, the way you read the part of a will nobody is going to contest. Tract 7, the Northwest, 160, native grass, no live water, abandoned well, sold as is where is. Who'll start me? Give me 20 an acre. 20. Somebody give me 20 to get it sold. Nothing. Men shifted in their chairs. A few were already standing up to leave, figuring the good of the sale was over. 15 then. 15 an acre to take the bad land off the bank's hands. 15. A scrap hauler from down by the river raised his card halfway. He did not want the land. He wanted the windmill steel and the well casing and whatever wire was still standing. 10, he said. I've got 10, said Vern, and you could hear in his voice that 10 was about what he'd expected and that he'd be glad to be shed of it. $10 an acre, who'll make it 12? 12 anywhere. The Rapid City man with the gold watch, half out of boredom, half because $10 an acre for 160 acres was less than he'd paid for the watch, lifted his card. 12. 12, I've got 12. 15 now. Gimme 15? Della stood up. She did not raise her card high. She raised it to her shoulder, where Vern could see it, and not many others could, and she said, in a voice that was quieter than she meant it to be and carried farther than she expected, 15. The laugh started before her number was all the way out of her mouth. It was not a cruel laugh, most of it. It was the laugh of tired men at the end of a long cold morning being handed something to laugh at, the girl in the dead man's coat bidding on the deadest ground in the county. Sig Burdett turned half around in his chair to see who it was and snorted smoke through his nose. The scrap hauler grinned. Vern Stroud looked at her over his glasses for one beat longer than he looked at anybody, and then the auctioneer in him took the bid the way an auctioneer takes any bid, because money is money and the card is up. 15, number 9. I've got 15. 18 now, who'll say 18? The Rapid City man, who did not like being run up by a teenager any better than Sig Burdett would have, lifted his card with a small tight smile. 18. 20, said Della, before Vern could even turn back to her. That stopped the laughing. 20 was an answer too quick to be a child's. There is a difference between someone bidding because they don't know better and someone bidding because they know something you don't, and the room felt the difference and didn't like it. The Rapid City man looked at her for a long moment. He looked at his watch. He looked at the plat on the wall, at that far corner against the Montana line with the words "No live water" printed across it in the bank's own hand, and he did the arithmetic of a man who buys things to flip them and cannot see the angle. He shook his head and set his card on his knee. 20 an acre, going once, said Vern. Tract 760, $20, going twice. He paused. He looked at the girl, and something crossed his face that Della would not understand until years later. Sold. Number 9. The gavel came down on the plywood with a flat crack, and a 15-year-old girl in her grandfather's coat had bought the 160 acres that every man in the room had agreed, before she ever walked down the stairs, was already dead. $20 an acre. $3,200 for the quarter. The bank's terms were 10% down before she left the building and the balance in 20 banking days. $320. She had 610. She walked up to Phyllis's table with the tobacco tin and counted it out, and her hands were steady until the last 2 bills, and then they were not, and she pressed them flat on the table so Phyllis wouldn't see. Phyllis counted it back and made her sign the purchase agreement in 2 places, and Della signed it in a small, careful hand, Della M. Voss, and slid the rest of the money back in the tin. $290 left in the world, and 20 banking days to find 3,000 more, and a hole in the ground that no one had drilled yet, and that might come up dry as a bone, and make a public fool of a dead man she loved. Vern Stroud stepped down off the riser while his clerk opened the bidding on the personal property, the tractors and the cake feeder, and the rest of a family's working life laid out on the courthouse lawn. He came over to where Della was folding the agreement into her grandfather's folder. The county had started filing out around them. A few of the men slowed as they passed, the way you slow at a wreck. "Girl," Vern said. His greater voice was lower now, almost gentle, and that was somehow worse. "I don't know who put it in your head that that was a buy, but whoever it was did you no favor. That ground's been dead since before your mother was born. The door well quit 50 years ago, and it's never come back, and there's a reason no grown man in this room would give $10 for it." Della looked up at him. "The door well only went 210 feet, she said. Vern blinked. It was stovepipe casing into the upper sand, she said. That zone always quits in a real drought. The deep sand's at 640. The state hit it 4 miles east of here in 47, and it flowed without a pump. The door well never got near it. She held the folder against her chest. It didn't quit at the water. It quit at the pipe. For a moment the auctioneer did not say anything at all. Behind him 2 or 3 of the slow-walking men had stopped altogether, close enough to hear, and the basement had gone quieter than an auction basement ever gets. "Where'd a 15-year-old come by all that?" Vern said. It was not quite a question. "State Water Bulletin, 48. It's upstairs in the courthouse. Anybody could have read it." She paused. "And my grandfather's logs. He kept the 1917 well log. He's the one figured the depth." Vern's eyes moved over the gray footlocker by her boots. "Who was your grandfather?" "Hal Ryerson." The name landed on the old man like a hand on his shoulder. Della watched something pull tight in his face and then let go. "Hal," he said. He looked away, toward the stairs, toward the cold square of daylight at the top. "Hal Ryerson drilled the well at my place in 1959, told me that same year there was deep water under my south section if I'd let him go after it. I told him I wasn't going to spend a year's calf check chasing his daddy's story." He was quiet. He never said a hard word about it. Just packed up his rig and drove off and put in the shallow well I asked for, and that well's gone alkali on me twice since. Della said nothing. There was nothing to say that wouldn't have been cruel. "He was a careful man, your grandfather," Vern said finally. "Carefulest man I ever knew with a number." Then he looked back at her, and the auctioneer came back into his face, the man who has watched 1,000 people be sure of a thing and be wrong. But careful men hit dry holes, too. "You know what a dry hole costs?" "Yes, sir." "You got it?" "No, sir." Vern Stroud looked at her a long moment. "No," he said. "I didn't figure you did." And he put his hat on and went up the stairs to finish selling the Duer's tractors, and that was the end of the first day Della Voss owned 160 acres of dead land. The low point did not come in the basement. It came at 11 o'clock that night at the kitchen table, after her mother had gone to bed and come back out in her robe because she'd heard Della still up, and the 2 of them sat under the one yellow bulb with the purchase agreement between them. Karen Voss was not a soft woman. The years had not let her be. But she was fair, and she had not raised her voice once since Della came home and told her what she'd done. She had listened to the whole of it now, the report and the map and the swell in the rock and the deep sand at 640 feet, the case Della had been building in the dark for 8 months and never once said out loud all the way through. "Della," she said when it was done, "I believe you read it right. I do. You're your grandpa's, head to foot, and he could read that ground." She turned the agreement around on the table. "But reading it isn't drilling it. $3,000 to the bank in 19 days. And a deep well in that country, 600-700 feet, that's not a stock well price. That's more money than we have ever had at one time in this house, even before we lost the place. And if the man drills it and it's dry—" She stopped. "If it's dry, I lose the deposit and the land, and everybody who laughed today gets to be right," Della said. "I know that, Mom. I've known that since February. That's not the part that scares me." "What's the part?" Della looked at her hands. "If it's dry, then it's not just me that was wrong. It's him. Everything he taught me. All those books. I'll have stood up in that basement and bid his whole life out loud, and they'll get to say the old man was simple after all, and I'll be the proof." Her voice did a thing she didn't let it do often. "I'd rather it cost me the money than that." Karen Voss got up and came around the table and put her hand on the back of her daughter's neck the way her father used to do, and they sat like that a while. And neither of them said anything, because there was nothing to say that the morning wouldn't have to answer for itself. In the morning she read the 1948 table again, and the 1917 log and the structural map, and she could not find the mistake because there wasn't one. Then she and her mother got in the green Ford and drove to see a man about drilling a hole. Emmett Stahl ran 2 rotary rigs out of a steel building on the gravel north of town, and he had been pulling water out of the ground for 30 years, which meant he had drilled enough dry holes to respect how much hope could cost a man. He was about 55, thick through the chest and shoulders, with drilling mud worked so deep into the creases of his hands no soap would ever get it out. When Della and her mother came into the shop, he was bent over a mud pump with a wrench, and he straightened up and looked at the girl, and then at the gray footlocker she carried two-handed by the leather strap, and something in his face shifted before either of them had said a word. "That's Hal Ryerson's locker," he said. "Yes, sir." "I'd know it anywhere. I helped him carry it more than once." He set the wrench down. "You'd be the granddaughter." She laid it out for him on the workbench under the shop light. The sale bill, the 1948 report, open to the table, with the test hole depth marked. The structural map. The 1917 log with her grandfather's 2 pencil lines. The whole case. Emmett Stahl read for the better part of 40 minutes, slow, his thick finger moving down the columns, turning back and forth between the report and the log, and he did not flatter her, and he did not laugh, and he did not say any of the soft, kind things. When he came to the line that said "quit at the pipe, not at the water," he stopped on it a long time. "He showed me this log once," Emmett said. "Years back. Tried to get me to go in with him on a hole over by the Doer place. We were both younger." He shook his head, not at her, at himself. "I told him the same thing everybody told him." "Will you drill it?" Della said. Emmett looked at her hands the way Vern had, the small cracked knuckles, the half-moon scar across the back of one from a wire that had gotten away from her. "You know what this'll run. Deep hole, good casing, cement. More money than that whole quarter's worth on paper." "I don't have it," she said. "I won't lie to you. I've got $290 and 20 days to find 3,000 more for the bank, and after that, I'm empty." Emmett Stahl leaned back against the bench and folded his arms. "And what exactly are you asking me to do, girl?" "I'm asking you to drill it on the comm," she said, and her voice was steady now, because this was the part she had practiced. "You drill to 700 feet. If it flows, I sign you a first lien on the water income, and you get paid off the top before I take a dime, however long that takes. If it's dry, you eat half your cost as a bad bet, the same as I'm eating the land, and I work the other half off at your shop and on your rigs, hauling, swamping, whatever you've got, for as long as it takes. In writing. And if it's dry, you don't owe me a kind word, and you tell anybody who asks that I talked you into it against your judgment, because I did." There was a long quiet in the shop. Somewhere in it a compressor kicked on and ran and shut off. "You thought this all the way through," Emmett said. "I've had 8 months." He looked at her mother. "You'll co-sign. The law won't let her hold paper at 15. "I'll sign," Karen Voss said. "I've read what she's read. I think she's right." A pause. "And if I'm wrong, then we'll both work it off, because I'm not letting her do it alone." Emmett Stahl picked up the 1948 report and looked at the test hole depth one more time, and then he closed it. "I'll drill 1 hole," he said. "I go to 700 unless the cuttings tell me to quit sooner or keep going longer, and I'll be the judge of that, not you and not the bank. You sign the lien, your mother co-signs, and we do it in writing the way you said, and whichever way it comes out," he looked at her hard, "nobody in this county gets to say Emmett Stahl took a child's money, because I'm not taking a dime of it till there's water to pay me. We clear?" "Yes, sir." He almost smiled. "Your grandfather'd have liked you better than he liked me," he said. "He never trusted a man who agreed with him too quick." They moved the rig onto the Door quarter on the 9th of November, and the country came to watch, the way it always came to watch a thing it had already decided was foolish. The first morning, there were 2 pickups parked along the section line. By the third day, there were 9, and Sig Burdett's gray Suburban among them, men standing around the tailgates with thermoses and their hands in their coat pockets, watching steel turn in the cold. Nobody would admit they'd driven out to see a girl be wrong. But none of them left either, and that told its own story. It was hard ground to drill in November. The first snow had come and gone, and the gumbo on top froze at night and turned to grease by midday, and Emmett's crew laid plywood and cussed and kept the rig running. The first 150 feet was the country everyone knew. The dry upper zone, the thin alkali sand the 1917 well had drilled into, and the shallow stock wells all drew their poor water from. At 110 feet, they got a little of that tired upper zone water, and one of the men on the section line said loud enough to carry, "Well, there's the famous deep water," and a couple of the others laughed. Della, by the truck with her grandfather's gauge in her coat pocket, did not answer, because she knew what that water was, and knew it was not the thing she'd come for. Then Emmett drilled into the shale, and the shale is where the doubt lived. The Granero Shale, the cap rock, the lid Hal had spent his life talking about, ran nearly 500 feet thick under that quarter, and drilling through 500 feet of gray shale is the most faith-killing thing a person can stand beside. Day after day the cuttings came up the same dull gray. No water, no change, deeper than any well in that part of the county had ever gone, and still nothing but gray. By the second week the pickups on the section line had thinned out. Men came once, saw 500 feet of nothing, decided they'd been right all along, and went home to their chores. Sig Burdett stopped coming. The scrap hauler stopped coming. The cold got worse. At a little over 200 feet, in the second day of the shale, the bit hit something that wasn't shale, a hard clatter that ran up the pipe and made Emmett slow the rig and pull a sample. It was rust, old broken stovepipe casing, eaten to lace, and a plug of rotten wood and rock above it. They had drilled into the bones of the 1917 well. There it was, exactly where the log said it would be. The dead well that had condemned the whole quarter, choked off at 210 feet, 500 feet, of solid ground between it and the water it had been blamed for losing. Emmett held a flake of the rusted casing out to Della on his glove. "Stovepipe," he said, just like the old man wrote. She looked at it and didn't say anything, but she put it in her coat pocket next to the gauge, and she kept it. After that, it was just the shale again, and the cold, and the boredom that is worse than fear, because fear at least keeps you sharp. There was a morning near the end when the temperature went to 9 below, and the diesel gelled, and they lost half a day getting the rig to turn over. And Della sat in the cab of the green Ford and watched the men work and thought, with a clear and terrible calm, that she might have been wrong. Not about the report. The report was right. But about the structure. About whether the shale cap was whole under this particular quarter, or whether there was some break in it she couldn't have seen from a 50-year-old map. Some leak that had bled the pressure off the way the old wells had bled it off, leaving the sand down there full of dead water that would never rise to meet a bit. You can read everything and still be wrong about the one thing the page didn't say. That was the truest thing her grandfather ever taught her, and the one she'd have given anything not to know that morning. On the 18th of November, at 620 feet, the cuttings changed. Emmett saw it before anyone. He bent over the shaker, the screen that sorted the cuttings out of the drilling mud, and he held up a gloved hand and slowed the rig, and he rubbed something gritty between his fingers and held it to the light. Sand. Clean sand. The first sand in 500 feet. The gray giving way to a pale tan that hadn't been on that screen all month. The 2 men on the crew stopped what they were doing. Della came down out of the truck and across the frozen ground and stood at the shaker, and Emmett tipped his palm toward her so she could see it, and she did not need him to tell her what it was, because she had read its name 100 times in a gray book by lamplight. Dakota sand, the deep sand, her grandfather's sand. "That's it," she said. Her voice came out wrong. "That's the bed." "That's the bed," Emmett said. "Now we find out if anybody's home." He drilled into it slow. At 631 feet, the mud in the hole began to do something it had not done in 500 feet of shale. It began to rise. The pressure in the deep sand, the pressure Hal Ryerson had believed in for 50 years and been laughed at for 50 years, was pushing back up the hole against the weight of the drilling mud, the way water pushes up a straw when you blow across the top, and Emmett felt it through the break and read it on the standpipe gauge, and his jaw set, and he started moving fast, calling to his men to mix the mud heavier, to get ready, because a well that comes in under pressure can hurt you if you're not its master. They set the casing and ran it down, and Emmett killed the rig, and the prairie went quiet except for the wind, and for a moment nothing happened at all. Della stood 10 feet back with her mother beside her, who had driven out that morning on a feeling, and the brass gauge in her own pocket forgotten in her fist. The men stood at the wellhead. Emmett bled the pressure off slow, cracking a valve, watching the gauge, and at first there was only a hiss and a little gray water, the dregs of the mud column, and one of the men on the section line, one of the few that were left, started to turn away. And then the water came. It did not roar. Hal had told her once that the movies got that part wrong, that real artesian water doesn't blow the rig over, it just rises, steady and unstoppable, the patient pressure of a thing that has been waiting 600 feet down for 10,000 years, and is in no hurry now. It came up the casing in a hard clear column and stood at the top, and then ran over the steel lip and down the sides, and out onto the frozen gumbo. And where it hit the snow it steamed, because deep water comes up warm out of the cold of the ground, and the steam rose off it in white ribbons in the 9-degree air and drifted across the dead quarter where nothing had run in 50 years. Clear water, cold, warm water. Water with no pump under it and no man's hand on it, rising out of the ground on its own and running off across the badland the bank had called dry, no live water, sold as is, and cutting a dark wet line through the snow toward the dry dam and the dead cottonwood that had, once, somebody planted it, expected exactly this. Nobody said anything for a while. The water ran. Emmett Stahl watched it, the way a man watches a thing he is not sure he'll see again, and then he took off his glove and bent down and put his bare hand flat in the flow and held it there until it ached, and stood back up and dried it on his coat. "Steady flow," he said, to no one in particular, the way a man says a thing to keep his voice working. 20 gallons a minute, maybe better. Won't water the whole county. Water plenty of cattle, though. Water 'em through a drought. He looked at the steam rising off the snow, and then he looked at Della, and the line of his mouth was not quite a smile. "Your grandfather drilled 40 wells in this country and got run out of every coffee shop in it for talking about this exact water." She said, "Yeah. In this cold till dark just to watch it run. And then he'd have driven straight to town to tell every man who laughed at him, and not one of them would have had the grace to look him in the eye." Della crouched down beside the casing where the water came over and put 2 fingers into the flow the way Emmett had, and it was cold warm and clean and real, and she stayed there a long time, and the steam came up around her hand, and she did not cry, because that was not a thing she did, but it was close. The story went the way stories go in a small county, slow for a day, while the few men who had seen it decided whether they believed their own eyes, and then everywhere at once, at the co-op and the cafe and the parts counter and the sale barn. Did you hear the Ryerson girl drilled the Doer place? Hit flowing water below 600. No pump on it. That last part was what did it, the part that turned the laughter inside out. Men who had passed on the quarter for $10 an acre started asking, for the first time, why the old well had died. Men who had given Hal Ryerson the soft kind look for 30 years went home and got quiet. A banker who had not returned Karen Voss's first call about the balance returned her second within the hour. Della did not sell the quarter. The first offer came fast, a number from the Rapid City man with the gold watch that would have paid off the bank and the driller and left enough to dent the mortgage on the home place her father had lost, and she turned it down without taking a day to think about it. She turned down the second one too, a better number from a man who wanted to bottle the water. She had not read a gray book by lamplight for 8 months and stood up in a basement full of laughing men to sell the answer the week after she found it. What she did instead was sign water leases. By spring she had agreements with 4 neighboring outfits whose own stock water went bad in dry years, contracts to run pipe off her well and water their cattle through the summer. It was not a fortune. It paid Emmett Stahl off the top, the way she'd promised, before she took $1, and it took most of 2 years, and Emmett never once pushed her. It cleared the balance to the bank, and around the dead dam, where the overflow ran and stood, the grass came back, the slow, tough grass that takes hold a season at a time once the ground learns it can risk it, and within 3 years there was a green. You could see from the section line on a quarter the bank had sold for the price of its scrap. The drought came in the summer of 1988, and it was a bad one, the worst in that country since the 30s, and it was the drought that finished the laughing for good. It went dry in May and stayed dry. The shallow wells started going bad in June, the alkali creeping up as the water tables dropped, the stock dams shrinking to cracked rings of dried mud. By July, the big outfits were hauling water and selling cows they didn't want to sell, and the cafe in town was full of men doing the worst math of their lives. And the Doer Quarter, the dead corner against the Montana line, ran on. The deep sand did not care that it hadn't rained. It had not rained on that water in 10,000 years, and the pressure stood where it had always stood. And Della Voss's well flowed 20 gallons a minute through the worst summer in living memory, and the cattle of 4 outfits drank from it while their owners' own wells went to salt. Sig Burdett came to see her in August. He was the man who had snorted smoke through his nose in the basement, the biggest outfit in that end of the county, who had 400 head now and not enough water to carry them. He drove out in the gray Suburban and found Della on the well, fixing a leak in the overflow pipe. 17 now and brown as a saddle, and he stood by his truck with his hat in his hand the way men of his kind only stand when the ground has finally gotten the better of them. He did not apologize. That was not in him, and she would not have believed it if it had been. He just asked in a flat, hard voice whether she had water to lease and how much and what she wanted for it. And Della Voss, who was old enough by then to know that there is a kind of victory that is sweeter for being quiet, named him a fair price, the same price she charged her other neighbors, not $1 more for the man who had laughed at her and ran him a line of pipe that week. He paid on time. He did not say, "Thank you." But the next spring he sent his oldest boy out to the quarter with a sale bill folded in his pocket, and a question, which was whether Della would drive over and look at a piece of ground the boy was thinking of buying, and read the water on it before he signed. And that was the thanks, and it was worth more than the other kind, and they both knew it. That was the year Della stopped being the girl who bought the dead land and started being the person you went to before you bought any land at all. She bought a second failed quarter the following year, 5 miles east, on the same swell of buried rock after 6 months of reading. She drilled it deeper, and it did not flow on its own. The structure was a little lower there, but it came in good with a pump, and the lease on it paid for itself in 2 seasons. She put her grandfather's footlocker on a shelf in a little steel office she built by the old door standpipe, and she added to it, because she kept the books now the way he had. When she was 22, she took down the faded plywood sign that had hung crooked on the front of her grandfather's old shop for 30 years, Ryerson Well and Windmill, and she had it repainted and hung over the door of her office, with one word changed, Ryerson Water. The well part was still true. The windmill part belonged to a country that was gone. But the name belonged to a man who had been right, and she was not going to let him be forgotten just because the county had spent 50 years not listening to him. By then, the men who had laughed in the courthouse basement were sending their sons to her with sale bills folded in their pockets, the same way Sig Burdett had, and she did with all of them what her grandfather had done with her. Before she would drive out and look at a single acre, she made them sit at the table in the little steel office and read the boring parts first, the gray bulletins and the old logs and the depth tables nobody wanted to read, because the boring parts were where the answers lived, and the answers had been there the whole time, free, public, written down, waiting 50 years in a courthouse for somebody to open the drawer. She was not selling them luck. She did not believe in luck. She was selling them the one thing her grandfather had died believing the county needed more than rain, the patience to read the record before you bid on the ground. Vern Stroud came out to the quarter in the fall of 1994. He was 71 by then and mostly retired, slowed by his knees and a cough that hung on too long every winter, and he drove out in a clean white car on a gray afternoon and parked by the office, and got out slow. The dead quarter was not dead. The dam held water. The grass ran green-brown to the buttes. There were cattle in the shade of a windbreak Della had planted her first spring, and the well still flowed, smaller than it had in '86, but steady, and you could hear it running over into the tank from where the two of them stood. They talked a while about the things old men and the people who outlast them talk about, auctions and drought and the men who were gone, and the price of pipe. And then Vern Stroud looked off toward the northwest corner, toward the standpipe of the old 1917 well that Della had never pulled out of the ground because she wanted it there to remind people, and he turned his hat around in his hands. "I came out here to tell you something I've owed you 8 years, he said. Della waited. She had learned that from her grandfather, too, the value of waiting and letting a man find his own words. "The day of that sale," Vern said, "when you told me about the depth and the deep sand and the stovepipe casing, I heard every word of it, and I want you to know that I shook your hand after, and I told the men around us that they ought to leave you be, not because I believed you." He looked at her steady. "I did it because of Hal, because of who your grandfather was. I figured you were a smart girl repeating a thing a stubborn old man had put in your head, and that the kindest thing was to let you have it without the whole county telling you it was foolish to your face. I patted you on the head, is what I did. In here." He touched his own chest. "I've been ashamed of it a long while." Della leaned against the rail by the tank, and the water ran into it, and she was quiet a moment. "At the start, I was repeating him," she said. "You weren't wrong about that. The first time I read that report, I was only checking his work." She looked at the water. "But there's a difference between repeating a man and reading him. He didn't leave me the answer. He left me the books. I had to find the answer myself, and I had 8 months to find out it wasn't there. And it was there. By the time I bid, I wasn't saying his words anymore. I was saying mine." Vern Stroud nodded slowly, like a man taking down a number he meant to keep. "There's a difference," he agreed. "I just never thought I'd have it explained to me by somebody 50 years younger than me." He almost smiled, and then he asked, the way Emmett had years before, whether he could see the water. She walked him out to the wellhead. He bent down, this old man who had spent 50 years up on a riser telling crowds of people what the ground was worth, and he put 2 fingers into the flow and held them there. For a man whose whole life had been the loud business of value, of bids and gavels, and the noise 100 people make deciding what a thing is worth, it was a strange and quiet thing to watch. He stood up and dried his hand on a handkerchief and looked at the steam, because it was cold again, and the water still steamed coming up. "All those years," he said, "I stood up on that plywood and let a room full of men shout at each other about what a piece of ground was worth. And the whole time I thought that was the part that decided it." He shook his head. "The bidding never decided a thing. The bidding just sorted out who'd read the file and who hadn't. Della looked at the water running over the steel. "The land was never poor," she said. "It was just never read." Vern Stroud laughed once, soft and tired, the cough catching at the end of it. "Hal's, head to foot," he said, which was the same thing her mother had said 8 years before, and he put his hat back on and drove off in the clean white car, and that was the last time Della saw him, because the cough did not let go of him that winter the way it never quite had. In the spring she got an envelope in the mail with no letter in it. Inside was a single bidder's card, soft and yellowed, from a sale 8 years gone. The number on the front was 9. On the back, in a shaky hand that had once been a steady one, the old auctioneer had written a line. It didn't say she had been clever or lucky or brave. It said something truer and quieter than any of those, the thing Vern Stroud had finally understood standing at the wellhead with his fingers in the water. It said, "I sold that ground for what the room believed." She paid what the record said. She was the only one in the building who'd done the reading. Della kept the card. She set it on the shelf in the steel office, above the footlocker, next to her grandfather's brass pressure gauge and the flake of rusted stovepipe casing she had carried out of the hole at 200 feet, and the logbook with the line on the flyleaf. The books are still there, more of them every year, the gray bulletins and the drilling logs and the depth tables, the boring proof a country needs more than it ever wants to admit. And the young ones still come, with their sale bills folded in their pockets, and she still makes them sit down and read the boring parts before she ever drives out to look at the land. Because the story was never really about a 15-year-old girl getting the better of a room full of grown men at an auction. It was about a whole county standing for 50 years on top of an answer it was too proud, too tired, or too certain to read. The water had not been hidden because anyone hid it. It had been sitting in a gray government book in the courthouse the entire time, free to anyone who would open the drawer. It was hidden the way the most important things are always hidden. It was hidden in the part nobody reads. And in the end, the land did not go to the man with the most money, or the loudest voice, or the surest opinion. It went to the one person in the building who had done the reading.